Hi everyone, it's Leela from Miss Kiss Kreations. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how I created this ice cream drip effect tumbler. All of my materials will be listed in my description below, including links and coupon codes. I will be using these sprinkles and mica powder from Glitiful.com, and I will have my 15% off coupon code in the description below. I will also have my link to where I purchased my tumblers and where I purchased my epoxy. With all that being said, let's go ahead and get started on this tasty tumbler. All right, so today I am using a 20-ounce stainless steel tumbler. I did purchase this from Maker Flow Crafts. A lot of y'all know I like to work with my football inside of my tumbler, so I always place it on here. It just gives me a little bit better control. I'm gonna start off with just sanding my tumbler down. I do use a sanding block, 180 grit sanding block. I do not wet this or anything. I just go ahead and sand it down. Once I have my tumbler sanded, I'm gonna go ahead and spray this with 91 or 99% alcohol. This is to remove all the oils. I am using a brand new paper towel, and what I do is I cut my paper towels down into thirds or fourths just to save on materials. You wanna make sure that you get the bottom as well. Make sure you sand the bottom very well, and make sure you're getting the top or the lip of your tumbler. A lot of times people forget this part, and the epoxy will repel if you don't wipe this down and sand this properly. So you don't want your epoxy repelling. Repelling means the epoxy will fish eye or create holes or bare spots on the tumbler. So you want to fully cover your tumbler with your 91% or 99% alcohol. Once your tumbler is wiped down and sanded, it's going to dry almost immediately. Make sure you don't touch your tumbler with your hands, only because you have oils on your hands and that might go on the tumbler and that might cause the epoxy to repel. Once it is finished, I'm gonna go ahead and spray this entire tumbler with my white spray paint. I am using Rust-Oleum brand. The one that I have is Ultra Matte White. You can use matte or flat or satin. I do recommend one of the 3 or 4. I do not recommend using gloss, only because gloss tends to make the epoxy repel, not as much as oils do, but it's a lot easier to apply epoxy and have the epoxy stick to a matte, flat, or satin surface rather than gloss. So I'm gonna go outside and spray paint this entire tumbler white, let it dry for about 20 minutes, and then I will return. I am back with my tumbler. It has been spray painted white and it has fully dried. I still have it on my football or my Turner arm, and my next step is going to be making the effect of the cone or the ice cream cone. It's gonna be with actually fishnet stockings. So if you see these stockings, whenever you put them on the tumbler, this is what the effect's going to be. So it's similar to the fish and lure tumbler. And I kept this on here just to show y'all what it will look like whenever I put it on my tumbler. Just to make this a little easier, I'm just gonna go ahead and take one of the legs of the fishnet stockings and go ahead and just cut it down just so I can handle them a little easier. I might cut it a little shorter, or I might keep it this way only so I can reuse these for the longer or bigger tumblers. All right, so I have my tumbler off of the Turner arm, and then I'm going to place it upside down on my table. I'm going to take the opening of my fishnet stockings and just place it on the tumbler. And then I'm going to take the excess of the fishnet stockings, or you can cut this, and I'm just going to place it inside of the cup. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of make this tight. So I want the stockings to be as tight as possible so we can have a nice grip on the tumbler. And if you notice, the tighter it is, the bigger the diamonds are. So if it's loose, then the diamonds are smaller. So you make it whichever way you like. If you want it to be bigger, go ahead and make it more tight. If you want it to be smaller designs on your tumbler, go ahead and make it more loose. I have my tumbler right side up, and I place the excess fishnet stockings, and inside of my tumbler, I'm going to take my football and put the football on top of the stocking. So this helps it stay on the tumbler. It helps it stay taut on the tumbler. So if you see what I did, I just placed it inside of there, and then I just placed the football inside of the tumbler, and if you see, that made it taut. So you can do it this way, and this doesn't move. And you can see the bottom. I don't really worry about the bottom, but if you want to make the bottom not with this design, you can go ahead and just cut around and just keep the bottom blank. Whatever you want to do with this, I'm going to leave it like this because I don't worry too much about the bottoms of my tumbler. Now that I have this the way I want it, I am now going to spray paint my tumbler a tan or a light brown. I have a couple light browns on hand, so don't be too specific about the brown. Cones come in all different colors, so it does not have to be exactly these colors. So I have these, this by Kreations, it's satin brown boots. And then I have a Rust-Oleum satin nutmeg. So it does not have to be these exact colors. Both of them will look great, or if you have a shade that's similar to this, even lighter than this, your tumbler will turn out great either way. So I'm gonna go outside and spray this, and then I'm gonna let it sit for about 20 to 25 minutes and make sure it is completely dry before removing the fishnet stockings. So the color that I chose was satin brown boots, only because I had more of this and I wanted a full covered tumbler. And like I said, I'm just going to spray paint the tumbler. I'm not going to touch the fishnet stockings. I'm just going to spray paint right over it. So I'm just going up and down the tumbler. I'm not getting too close. I always spritz my tumbler only because it gives a even finish with the spray paint. This way I don't have too many drips on my tumbler, and I just take my time with it. And then I'm gonna go ahead and hit the bottom. You wanna make sure you don't see any white on your tumbler. You wanna make sure it is fully covered. So go over it again until you have that fully covered tumbler. I am about 5 to 6 inches away from my tumbler. I'm not too close. The closer you get, the heavier spray paint is going to go on your tumbler, and you don't want that. You don't want that, because if you do get too close to your tumbler, then it is going to drip. And I'm going to let this sit for about 20 to 25 minutes until it is completely dry. Your temperature might be a little different than mine, so it might take longer or a shorter time to dry. Just make sure your tumbler is completely dry before we remove the fishnet stocking. And I'll see you then. All right, so I have my tumbler. It is completely dry. I'm gonna take it off of my football arm and then take my fishnet stocking off of the tumbler. And there you have it. Again, it is very, very important that your tumbler is completely dry, because if it isn't dried, whenever you go to take off your fishnet stockings, it's going to smear the paint, the spray paint, and it's not going to have that effect on it. Now, if you see the bottom of mine, I didn't have mine super, super tight at the bottom. It did make kind of an effect. I'm not really bothered by it. It looks kind of cool. The front will just not be this side. This will be the back side now, which is perfectly fine. But this is the effect that you should have. So for the next step of this tumbler, I'm going to apply 1 coat of epoxy over this tumbler. It's going to be a very thin coat. This coat is just for the design to stay on the tumbler, so it does not have to be very thick. I'm probably going to use about 10 milliliters of epoxy. So I'll be using about 5 milliliters of part A and 5 milliliters of part B. Again, the only reason for this coat of epoxy is just so the design can stay on here. I will be applying a decal. So if I apply a decal right now and I place it down with some transfer tape, I peel up the transfer tape, it's going to peel up the spray paint. So that's the reason for the epoxy. All right, y'all, I am back and I have my epoxy mixed off screen. If I sound funny, I do apologize. I have my face mask on, and I have mixed my epoxy, and now I'm going to apply it to my tumbler. I mixed very little amount of epoxy. I'm only going to be adding about 10 milliliters of epoxy, 10 to 15. So that's about 5 milliliters of part A and 5 milliliters of part B. Again, I don't want a lot on this tumbler because this is just to protect the design on the tumbler. So I'm putting a very, very thin amount on here. When I'm finished with this tumbler, when I'm finished adding the epoxy to my tumbler, I will let it spin on the turner for about 4 to 6 hours. Whenever I'm done, or whenever I turn off the cup turner, I'm going to let it air cure or air dry up to 24 hours. So I'll let it sit on the turner for about 4 to 6 hours and then let it air dry or air cure for another about 18 hours. So the reason why I wait a full 24 hours for this is because I want this epoxy to be completely cured or dried whenever I go and place my decal. The next step is going to be decaling this tumbler, and I don't want my transfer tape ripping up the epoxy. So the epoxy is still a little wet, or it's not cured all the way. Then whenever you place that vinyl on your tumbler, when you go to rip up that transfer tape or peel up the transfer tape, it might take the epoxy with it. So I always play it safe, and I always wait 24 hours. That might be a little excessive, but I'd rather be safe than sorry and mess up my tumbler and have to redo it. And make sure you are epoxying the bottom. Again, a very, very small amount of epoxy on your tumbler. And my tumbler is completely covered with epoxy. Again, I'm gonna let this spin and sit and air dry or air cure, and I'll see y'all in about 24 hours.
As you can see, I added a very thin coat of epoxy onto my tumbler. Again, I just added a thin coat just to lock in the design, and now I'm going to be adding my decal. And here's how the tumbler turned out with the decal. I first placed the pink decal on the tumbler, and then I realized the pink didn't pop as much as I wanted to, so then I added the white decal on top just to offset it. For my next step, I am going to epoxy my tumbler over the decal to lock in the design.
All right, so let's go ahead and epoxy this tumbler. I sound funny because I do have my face mask on. I do apologize. I've already mixed my epoxy off camera, and I have about 15 milliliters of epoxy in this tumbler, in this cup. So I have about 7.5 of part A and 7.5 of part B. So I'm using a little bit more than the time before, and this is just to lock in any decals I have. So you can use 20 milliliters. This is a 30-ounce tumbler. I always like to not overuse epoxy, obviously, to stay frugal, and I just don't like a very, very thick cup. So I like to use as little as possible if I can get away with it. So if you are using 25 or 20 milliliters of epoxy in your tumbler instead of my 15, go ahead, it's fine. I've done that before, but I just like it a little thinner just to have that decal locked in. All right, and then don't forget to do your bottom. Once I'm finished applying this epoxy to this tumbler, I'm going to let it spin and air cure. I'm going to let it spin for about 4 to 6 hours. Once it is done spinning for about 4 to 6 hours, I'm then going to let it air cure or air dry for another 6 hours. And about 12 to 15 hours is when I'll kind of check on it. It shouldn't be sticky. If it is, I'm just going to let it dry more, and then we'll go ahead and move on to the next step.
I am back with this tumbler. It's been sitting and spinning on the turner for about 24 hours or so. So now the text is completely secured in or sealed in with the epoxy. For the next step of this tutorial, I am now going to make the drip effect or the ice cream on top of the cone. The way that I'm going to be doing this is I'm going to be taking some mica powder from Glitterful Glitters. I'm going to take a little bit of acrylic paint, and I'm going to add it to already mixed epoxy. And then I'm going to let the epoxy harden, and depending on the type of epoxy that you'll be using, depends on how long you have to wait for the epoxy to harden. The epoxy that I will be using today for this tumbler is going to be Amazing Clear Cast, so I'm going to let it sit for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then I'm going to check on it. Again, it all depends on what epoxy brand that you use, and it does depend on the temperature of your room. So your epoxy might take 45 minutes,
Mine might take 2 hours, yours might take an hour and a half. So you have to make sure that you really just keep an eye on it. Go do other crafts and just keep an eye on the consistency. And whenever I get the right consistency, I'm going to show you what the consistency should look like and feel like. So I'm now mixing my epoxy. I do have my respirator mask on, so excuse me if I sound funny. I mix my part A and part B. I mix one part of part A and one part of part E. So I did 10 milliliters of part A and 10 milliliters of part B, equaling 20 milliliters of epoxy. So I have 20 milliliters of epoxy in here. I have nothing added to this epoxy. I am just going to stir the epoxy for the 2 to 3 minute time to make sure it is completely stirred properly and it's mixed and everything is, it has a good consistency, so I can then add my paint and mica powder. All right, so I have my epoxy stirred properly. And you see there are a lot of bubbles in here, but that's okay. Over time, the bubbles will disappear and there will be fewer bubbles. So that is okay if you see bubbles in your epoxy. I'm now going to add my paint, which is just white paint from Walmart. It's Apple Barrel brand. And then I'm going to add a little bit of mica powder. It's Snow Magic from Glitterful Glitters. I just want to add a little bit of shimmer to the white ice cream. I know ice cream typically doesn't have shimmer, but I just wanted to see what will happen whenever I add this beautiful mica powder to this mix. You can see the shine. It has a nice silver white shine to that. And then I'm going to add the white paint to obviously add the color to your ice cream to make it look like it is actually ice cream. I am choosing white. I know that ice cream comes in all different colors, so you can choose pink. You could choose any color you like to go along with your tumbler. There's no right or wrong way to do this, especially with the ice cream part, because you can have chocolate ice cream, you can have strawberry, you can have cherry. I'm just going to go with a white because I'm going to be adding sprinkles to this, and I want the sprinkles to kind of pop. So you see with that acrylic paint and that mica powder added, the mica powder gave it a nice little shimmer. I don't know if it's catching it on the camera, but it gives it a nice little shimmer to that, and that's what I wanted. This is very important. Whenever you are stirring your acrylic paint with your epoxy, you're going to see your acrylic paint and epoxy separate. Keep stirring your epoxy until you no longer see the two-tone color. So you have to keep stirring until your epoxy is one color. You're going to see little strands of dark white or whichever color you're using. Make sure you're stirring until your epoxy is one solid color. It might take 30 to 40 seconds, but this is very important because whenever you apply this to your tumbler, you're going to see those strands, and you just don't want to see that. It looks a little tacky on the tumbler. You want one solid, smooth color. My epoxy is now stirred with my mica powders and my paint. Now what I want to do is I want to let this sit out. So I'm just going to leave it on my counter, on my tabletop, and I'm just going to let this naturally harden or cure. I'm going to set my timer for about 45 minutes, and then I'm going to come back and check it. Right now you can see I just got finished stirring it, so if I were to put this on my tumbler, it's going to drip. Gravity's going to take over. It's going to go right to the bottom of the cup. I want a very, very thick consistency, almost like melted chocolate. So when I put it on my tumbler, it does drip down, but it stays halfway on the tumbler. So if I put this on my tumbler now, it's going to drip all the way down and it's going to go all the way at the bottom. If that's the look you want to go for, that's perfectly fine, but I want to kind of keep it above the text here. So if you need to set your timer for every 10 minutes or 20 minutes, go ahead and do that. I'm going to set it for about 45 minutes, and then I'll check back in with y'all, and then I'll be right back. It's been about 45 minutes since I've stirred my epoxy and I let it sit. So I just wanted to show y'all the progress of it after about 45 minutes. If you notice, whenever I lift my wooden stick out of my cup, it still drips. So whenever you put this on the tumbler, it's gonna keep dripping and dripping and dripping until it gets to the bottom. So I'm gonna check in on it again in about 20 to 30 minutes. I don't think it's hard enough for it to go on the tumbler because it's still having that fast drip effect. And again,
I don't want it to go at the bottom of the tumbler. I just want it kind of above, or maybe running a little lower than the Life is Sweet decal. So I'll check back in another 20-30 minutes. All right, guys, I'm back, and it's been about an hour and 10 minutes, so about 70 minutes since I've mixed my epoxy. And you can see my epoxy is very, very hard. It is curing very quickly. So I checked on it after 45 minutes, and so it's been about 25-30 minutes since I last recorded. So now I'm going to apply it to the top of my tumbler. So I typically leave my football arm inside of my tumbler, but I'm going to take it out on this step just in case I need to put my cup upside down or right side up, depending on how hard the epoxy is. So I'm going to take my tumbler and then my epoxy, and you're just going to grab basically a wooden stick full or a clump of epoxy, and then you're going to put it on the rim of the tumbler, and you're just going to kind of let gravity take over and just let it fall. You're not going to notice it falling really quickly at first. That's okay, because it's going to take about 4 to 6 hours to cure, and gravity is going to take over, and it's going to fall over time. So you kind of have to baby it, and you'd rather have less on here at first than more, because right now you see it's not going to drip now, but over time that drip is going to get bigger and bigger. So I'm going to grab another piece of epoxy or another ball of epoxy, and I'm going to put it on my popsicle stick. You can use a bigger popsicle stick if you need to, or you can use the smaller one like myself. And I'm just kind of putting it on the rim, and then I'm rolling the tumbler towards me as I'm guiding the epoxy on the top of the tumbler. And you just do this until you're satisfied with the amount of epoxy you have on the top of the rim. I kind of have my base right here, and you see there's a very small amount of epoxy. Again, you can always add more, so I'm just going to add to this. I would rather have too little at first than too much, and it drip too much, or take over the entire tumbler and kind of drip onto my Life is Sweet text. So you can see this is already starting to drip. So I'm going to take more epoxy, and I'm just going to repeat the same steps. And it's kind of hard to work with because it is curing epoxy, so it's stringy and you might make a mess. So that's why I'm working over my silicone mat. It's easier for me. So if it does drip on the silicone, just leave it and it'll harden, and you can peel it up after. So if you see right here, I have a little bit of epoxy. So I'm just going to do the same thing, repeat the steps, and just add more epoxy. This is a very tedious process, so take your time with it and just keep adding more epoxy until your desired look. So if your epoxy gets too hard, or you think it you can't work with it, you can always use your heat gun and heat up a little bit, just a little bit, because if you put a lot of heat, it's going to really pour down your tumbler, and it's going to drip all the way down. So let's say my epoxy just got too hard, and then I want to add more epoxy to this part of the tumbler. I'm sorry, right here. What I can do is I can take a clump of epoxy again, and then add it to the part where I want, which is going to be right here. I like to add it sideways, and then I kind of blot it on the tumbler. And then once it's on, if you see that it doesn't look smooth, or you see it looks chunky or uneven, go ahead and take your heat gun and apply literally 3 to 5 seconds of heat on there, and then it's going to smooth out. And once gravity takes over, or in a couple hours, it's going to smooth out with the rest of the epoxy that you added. And don't worry about messing up the rim of your tumbler. I go off the rim. So if you saw what I did, I took my epoxy and I added it to the rim of the tumbler, and then I kind of sat the tumbler on its side, or rolled it over, and then I rolled it. So I start at the rim, and then once I'm done rolling it, I sit it straight up. So that way you can have the epoxy run down. I'm not worried about this rim getting clumpy or hardened up there because I'm going to take an X-Acto knife after here and clean up the rim. So don't focus on that. Just focus on where you're putting the drips, where it's dripping, and how much epoxy you want on the tumbler. Also, if your epoxy is too thin and it's dripping too quickly, or it might be dripping over the text like mine is, you can go ahead and just flip your tumbler upside down and then let gravity work back, I guess, down or up the tumbler so it doesn't drip onto your text. So if you do want to do that, this kind of is, like I said, a tedious process, and you have to kind of baby the tumbler for the first hour, checking on it to make sure it doesn't drip all the way down the tumbler if that's not what you want. Like I told y'all earlier, I like applying it whenever the tumbler is parallel to my desk, and then I kind of turn it towards me or away from me. It's easier for me to apply. If it's easier for you to apply whenever the cup's right side up, go ahead and do that. But for me, I like to do it this way, and then I kind of scrape it on the rim, and then I just stick it right side up. So then it falls down that way. So I apply it on like this with it parallel to the ground, sideways. And then I scrape the epoxy on the rim of the tumbler. Once I have the epoxy on the rim, I then lift it right side up, and then I let the epoxy run down. And then if it's pouring down, or if it's running down, dripping down too quickly, your epoxy is too thin, go ahead and turn your tumbler upside down. Let it sit there for about 5-10 minutes, and just go back and forth and just baby it. Now that I have my epoxy on my tumbler the way that I want it, I'm going to add the sprinkles before it hardens and while it's still tacky. So the sprinkles that I'm using is from Glitterful Glitters, and again, I will have their link in my description below, and I will have my coupon code in my description below as well for their sprinkles, their glitters, and their mica powders. I'm going to take a pair of tweezers, and I'm going to, you can either do this with tweezers or you can pick this up with your hand, whichever one you like. And then I'm just going to take a couple sprinkles, and I'm just going to place them around the tumbler and let them fall whichever way they fall. Just like as you would normal sprinkles or real sprinkles on your ice cream cone. I'm just going to place these all around the tumbler, and you can add as many or as little as you want. Again, this is your tumbler, so make it your own. And then while you're adding your sprinkles to your tumbler, don't forget that your epoxy is still wet. So you still have to manipulate the epoxy so it doesn't go down, or doesn't fall too far down or stay too far up. So you still have to remember that the epoxy is still curing. Whenever you add the sprinkles to your dripping epoxy, go ahead and press them on and to the epoxy so they have a good grip. So whenever you wash it, or if you whenever you use your tumbler, they're really stuck into the epoxy and they adhere to the epoxy properly. So go ahead and just take your tweezers, take your fingers, and just kind of give it a good little push or press down on the sprinkles, just so they can stick on your epoxy. So I finished applying the epoxy to the tumbler, and I added the sprinkles. And I'm kind of just letting my tumbler sit straight up and down, and then if it drips too much, I just do it upside down, and I'm just repeating the process. I'm concerned about this piece right here. So what I did was I took my gloved finger and I just put a lot of pressure on it, and I kept swiping it up or sliding it up, getting rid of some epoxy. Because my end goal is I want to just leave this tumbler how it is right now. And I just want gravity to take over, like I've been saying, and I don't want to worry about the epoxy running over the Life is Sweet. I kind of want any long drips to go beside or down the ice cream cone or down the tumbler, away from the text. So I don't want the text to be covered. If that's a look that you're going for, that is completely fine. You can add that on yours, but for mine specifically, I kind of want like this drip to go down, and then this one as well. So I'm just keeping an eye out with this specific drip here, and I'm just taking my gloved hand, my gloved finger, and just putting pressure on it and keep kind of pushing it up. So I'm just going to leave this like it is, and I will check on it in about 20 to 30 minutes. I've been checking on this tumbler every 30 minutes for the last 3 hours. I have about an hour and a half to go before I can just let it rest. I've been putting it upside down and then right side up every 30 minutes. So what I do is I take it off of the pipe and then I put it on the silicone mat. And then if I notice, like I see here, the drip is touching the E. If I notice that it's dripping too much, I'll just put it right back on my drying station for another 30 minutes. And then if I notice it dripping too far down the other way, then I'll just put it right side up. And I kind of just do that every 30 minutes. And once I hit about 4 to 5 hours of drying time, I won't have to worry about this anymore. And then I'll just let it air dry, and I'll let it air dry right side up. Once it's been 4 to 5 hours, like I said, I'll put it on its right side up like so. And then I'm going to let it air dry or air cure for another 12 to 15 hours. You're going to want to let this tumbler dry completely or air cure completely for at least 20 to 24 hours. I'm going to let mine sit for 24 hours just to play it safe. And then once it has sat for 24 hours, we'll move on to the next step. Welcome back, y'all. And my tumbler has been sitting for 24 hours. So it's been 24 hours since I've placed the white drip or white epoxy on my tumbler. And right here, I kind of had to keep an eye out for it. So I kept sitting it right side up and upside down every 30 minutes or so, just so it can not go past the text here. And I wanted a longer drip on the side here, and that's what I kind of got. And you can see that the sprinkles are locked into place because it did cure with the epoxy. So you see how cute this is. This tumbler is so adorable for summertime. I love it for the kids. I love it for myself. It is adorable. As you see on the rim here, there's a lot of excess epoxy around the rim. So I'm gonna get rid of that with an X-Acto knife. So I'm gonna grab my X-Acto knife and I'll show y'all how to get rid of it. I have my X-Acto knife, and then I'm just going to find a spot on the rim of the tumbler, and I'm just going to place my X-Acto knife on there, and I'm just going to cut around the tumbler, and I'm forcing my X-Acto knife inside the tumbler. I'm not doing it towards the outside because I don't want to cut my design. So whenever you place your force, your pressure, you're going to place pressure towards the middle or in the inside of the tumbler. So if you accidentally slip with your X-Acto knife, it's going to go inside of the tumbler and not the outside, ruining your design. So you're gonna do this all around the lip of the tumbler or the top of the tumbler until you're satisfied or until all the epoxy's off. And all I do is I just put the excess epoxy inside of the tumbler because I'm gonna clean that out later. And then you'll see there's still, if you're heavy-handed like myself, you're gonna see there's a lot of epoxy inside of the tumbler. I'm going to take my X-Acto knife again and just kind of peel up that epoxy with my X-Acto knife. So it just, you put your knife in here and then you just stick your blade and the epoxy should come right up. So you just clean it up however you need to do it and however long it takes for you. Like I said, I'm very heavy-handed. As y'all can see, I have a lot of epoxy in here. So I'm gonna go ahead and go through this and then I will return. Now that you've removed all of the epoxy from the inside of the tumbler, you're now going to use your 100% alcohol. You're going to put it on a paper towel, and then you're going to wipe the inside, and that's going to get rid of any of the spray paint or any excess inks that you may have used, and it's going to come right off of the inside of the rim. So I didn't get all of the epoxy out of the inside just for the sake of the video, but I do want to show you that the acetone does remove the inks or any dyes that might have ended up inside of the tumbler. And make sure you get the rim because a lot of times the spray paint or the dyes that you use does end up around the rim. And once I'm finished doing this and the inside is completely cleaned out, I'm satisfied with how it looks. I'm then going to take it to my sink, and then I'm going to add Dawn dish soap and water, and I'm going to put it on a clean paper towel, not a used sponge, not a used rag, just a clean paper towel, and just wipe this out and clean it out, the inside and the outside, with Dawn dish soap. And once you've finished doing that, your tumbler is complete.
And that's how I clean the inside of every single one of my tumblers. So whether I'm doing this one, a glittered one, any tumbler, that's how I clean the inside. And here is the finished tumbler. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more craft videos and tumbler videos, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.